Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 701 for May 27th, 2018. Coming up in a few minutes.
Port Charlotte has always been in the shadows. We describe it as middle child syndrome. And I think anybody out there that is a middle child will understand exactly what that means. It's in the shadow of Bruichladdich, the namesake, named after the distillery, and then Octomore, this perceived cult product on the other side.
Port Charlotte is getting some much-needed love this weekend on Islay. Each year, the Sunday of Fagile Week is traditionally Bruichladdich Open Day, but this year you might confuse the place for Port Charlotte. Bruichladdich CEO Douglas Taylor will explain later on and discuss some of the concerns over whether Islay's distilleries are overwhelming the island. That's coming up later on WhiskyCast In-Depth, along with your voice, the calendar of events, behind the label, and in the What I'm Tasting This Week department, my tasting notes for a 5-alarm whiskey that you'll have to hear to believe. That's all ahead on this holiday weekend edition of WhiskyCast.
WhiskyCast, brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
This is whiskey, Johnny Walker's Scotch Whisky, from this place and these people, Scotch makers, creating the bold and complex flavour of Johnny Walker Black Label. Step right up.
Let's get started with the news. It's brought to you by Highland Park. We're less than a week away from the expiration of what the Trump administration has called the final extension on its exemption of the European Union countries from new tariffs on imported steel and aluminum. That extension ends this coming Friday, June 1st, and the U.S. is insisting that either the Europeans accept a quota limiting their steel and aluminum exports or face a 25% punitive tariff. Reuters reports the Europeans have offered to open up their markets to more U.S. exports in exchange for a permanent exemption from the tariffs, but EU Trade Commissioner Cecilia Malmström told reporters she cannot see her countries accepting quotas unless they're set at current export levels. As we've reported before, the Europeans have already drawn up a list of American-made products to be targeted with retaliatory tariffs if the U.S. moves forward with its steel and aluminum tariffs. That list includes bourbon and other American whiskeys. Sazerac is a step closer to building its second whiskey distillery in Tennessee. The Murfreesboro City Council has voted to approve Sazerac's request to rezone a piece of land along Interstate 24 for the new distillery, following several months of delays to address concerns from area residents. According to the Murfreesboro Post, Sazerac, the city, the state, and several neighbors will share the construction cost for 3 new roads between the site and a planned interchange with Interstate 24. The roads will be designed to keep truck traffic away from the entrance used by distillery visitors and minimize the traffic impact on the neighborhood. In addition, Sazerac agreed to reduce the height of its 4 warehouses on the site to make them less visible from both the neighborhood and the freeway. No word yet on when construction will begin. One other note on Tennessee whiskey and politics. We reported last month that Tennessee lawmakers had passed legislation that exempts whiskey barrels at the state's distilleries from local property taxes. Now, Governor Bill Haslam has signed that bill into law. It ends the dispute between Moore County and Brown-Forman. The county's tax assessor wanted Brown-Forman to pay property taxes on every barrel in its inventory. Not the whiskey maturing in those barrels, but the actual barrels themselves. Tennessee's Attorney General backed the county and said that ruling would apply to all of the state's distillers. Brown-Forman estimated the property tax on its barrels would have cost it almost $3 million a year. Meanwhile, Diageo is adding another new whiskey with a link to Tennessee. Cascade Blonde is a double chill-filtered whiskey said to be cut with water from the Cascade Spring, which is the same water source for George Dickel whiskies made at the Cascade Hollow Distillery. However, there are a couple of things to note. While the whiskey carries the name Cascade Hollow Whiskey Company, it does not mention George Dickel anywhere on the label, and it's labeled as an American whiskey, not a Tennessee whiskey. In fact, a little research shows the brand was created at Ledestri Spirits in Rochester, New York. That company specializes in contract manufacturing and packaging for all kinds of food and drink products. Right now, it's only available in Texas and Michigan and will sell for $20 a bottle. On that note, Diageo's Crown Royal Canadian whiskey is adding a Texas twist. Crown Royal Texas Mesquite is flavored with locally sourced mesquite wood and will be available in Texas and a handful of other markets for about $25 a bottle. I received a sample this week, and I'll have my tasting notes for it soon at whiskycast.com. Last time around, we reported that Irish Distillers had just introduced the latest whiskies in its Method and Madness collection of experimental Irish whiskies. In fact, we were recording that episode as the release event was going on in Dublin. The new whiskies are a single pot still finished in Hungarian oak and a 28-year-old single pot still matured in a ruby port cask. I discussed the new whiskies recently with Middleton Master Blender Billy Layton in Dublin, and the 28-year-old is a single cask bottling. That's a follow-up to the vintage 31-year-old single-grain single casks that were released in the Method and Madness debut during the fall of 2016.
It's kind of what you expect from a port cask then, plus a bit more, because you've got the basic pot still spicy distillate there, and that kind of enhances the port contribution. Port is really different from a sherry seasoned cask. For me, it's a little bit more. There is a little bit more wine comes through in the port, but it's the fruit that comes along with that. It's really rich. They're called stone fruit, like plums, black cherries, that type of character, and it's really a fulsome single pot still whiskey. And there is only going to be one single cask of this, so it's going to be very, very rare indeed, yeah.
And the second one?
The second new Method and Madness is, again, it's a single pot still. It's a younger pot still that has been finished in Hungarian oak. Again, what we've done, we've taken a lighter style of pot still whiskey. Again, this is part of an ongoing trial that we have. So we've taken a lighter style of pot still whiskey, and we chose that whiskey because what we understood about the Hungarian oak casks is that the particular region where the trees are grown, they're grown. It's in the sort of the northeastern part of Hungary. It's a volcanic area, so the soil quality is not fantastic. So it's Quercus petrea thrives there. Quercus rubra doesn't tend to do it. It grows better. The conditions are better in the southern oak growing region in Hungary. And because of it, the oak grows quite slowly. So the grain is much more compact. It's a tighter grain. So we felt that the contribution from that type of oak might be very controlled. Take a little time to develop with the whiskey. So the particular pot still is a lighter type of pot still that we used, which had only been matured in American oak, so ex-bourbon barrels. So we felt that there was kind of a complementary. There was a complement between the two of them, like the Hungarian oak with the tighter grain, and the American oak. So we over a period of months we saw the changes and the contribution coming from the wood. Like, these are unseasoned casks, toasted rather than charred. As we sort of monitored the casks over the first few months, we saw that the whiskey was developing quite nicely, and it was just over 11 months that we decided, this has reached a very nice balance now of the pot still, along with the Hungarian oak contribution. I think it's time to get it out of these casks now. So that's what we have.
Both whiskies will be available only in Ireland, the UK, and France. The Hungarian oak finish will sell for €89. That's around $104 a bottle. While the 28-year-old Ruby Port Pipe single cask has a price of €1,900. That's around $2,200 a bottle at current exchange rates. You'll find my tasting notes for both whiskies at whiskycast.com. While most of the attention this week in Scotland has been focused on Islay, where the Islay Festival of Malt and Music is getting underway this weekend, Glen Scotia Distillery in Campbellton released 2 new single malts during this week's Campbellton Malts Festival. They released an 18-year-old 2000 single cask festival bottling, with just 147 bottles available from the distillery exclusively at 150 pounds. That's around $200 a bottle. There's also a 2018 limited edition Ruby Port finish that was distilled in 2008 and matured in first fill ex-bourbon barrels, along with 6 months in Ruby Port casks. It's bottled at 57.8% ABV. 6,000 bottles will be available worldwide for 45 pounds. That's around $60 a bottle. There was one other Glen Scotia bottling unveiled during the week, a single cask bottling exclusively for those who attended Glen Scotia's whiskey dinner during the festival Tuesday night. You can keep up with the latest whiskey news all week long at whiskycast.com. The news is brought to you by Highland Park, the Orkney single malt with Viking soul. The holiday weekend usually means the start of vacation season, and if you're heading out on a road trip, why not take a bit of Highland Park with you? Of course, whiskey and driving never mix, but music and driving go together like peanut butter and jelly. Look for Highland Park's specially curated playlists on Spotify to add some music to your motoring this summer. And check out the entire range of whiskeys at highlandparkwhiskey.com. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events. We'll be talking more about the Islay Festival of Malt and Music in a few minutes with Douglas Taylor of Bruichladdich. But if you cannot be on the island this week, Ardbeg has more than 100 Ardbeg Day events worldwide starting this week and running through June 9th. We have links for them on the calendar of events page at whiskycast.com. Whiskey Live Louisville is this coming Saturday, June 2nd, and it's followed by the Kentucky Bourbon Affair in Louisville, June 5th through the 10th. Christie's will have an auction of rare spirits and wine on June 7th in London and in New York City, June 14th and 15th. Whiskey Live Melbourne is June 8th and 9th in Australia. The Whiskey X comes to Brooklyn, New York, June 8th. Westport Whiskey and Wine in Louisville has its 10th anniversary Bourbon Barrel Bash on the 16th. That same day is the Edinburgh Whiskey Festival in Scotland. M.B. Rowland Distillery's Pickin' on the Porch in Pembroke, Kentucky, and Sagamore Spirit Distillery's Whiskey on the Waterfront Party in Baltimore, Maryland. Right now we have 326 different events on our searchable calendar at whiskycast.com. If you have a whiskey tasting, a festival, or any other whiskey-related event coming up, just use the contact form on our website and let us know all about it.
This is whiskey. Johnny Walker's Scotch Whisky. From this place, and these places in that place. These are the people that make it. This is what they sound like.
Because you're a cheeky wee blighter.
Dance like. Aye, like that. This is what they do all day. Building the great character of Johnny Walker Black Label. Aging in oak for 12 long years.
Thanks. Oh, it's gorgeous there.
What is character? It's giving a damn.
You're alright, lassie.
Which looks like this. as much as this. See, the land that shapes these people and the people that shape this whiskey all shape how bloody good it tastes.
Put the bloody game on the telly, Ella.
A whiskey as bold as it is complex. For every step you take, this is Johnny Walker Black Label, friends. Step right up.
Cut.
Can I drink this now?
Johnny Walker Black Label Blended Scotch Whisky, 40% alcohol by volume, imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
Coming up later on Behind the Label, we'll take a look at how the pros travel with whiskey, even when it means leaving your bottles at the mercy of the airline. Right now, WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Lagavulin. And Lagavulin traditionally has the first distillery day of the Islay Festival of Malt and Music on the opening Saturday each year. But on Sunday, the action moves to the other side of Loch-in-Dal at Bruichladdich. Ever since Bruichladdich reopened back in 2001, they've always done things a bit differently, and it's no different this year. Douglas Taylor became Bruichladdich CEO last year after Simon Coughlin was given responsibility over all three of Remy Cointreau's whiskey distilleries around the world. Douglas and I spent some time on the phone this week.
Yet again, we're heading for one of the busiest days in the Bruichladdich calendar. It's 3,000 people converging on the courtyard. The sun usually shines, and hopefully it's going to do so again this year. We've actually got something very exciting this year in that the look and feel of the distillery is going to be much more Port Charlotte than it is Bruichladdich. So in the past, it's always been very much a Bruichladdich open day, but of course this festival day coincides with us relaunching the Port Charlotte brand. So you'll get a very, very distinct Port Charlotte feel when you come through the gates this year. So I'll not say too much about it, but we're excited about that as well. And of course, the festival bottling this year is a Port Charlotte bottling, which is from our very first Port Charlotte distillate going back to 2001.
Well, you might as well go ahead and tell us what you're doing with Port Charlotte and what you're doing around the festival, because this is going to run on Sunday, so everybody will have had a chance to see it, given the time differences.
Yeah, so we're turning the distillery into the Port Charlotte distillery for the day. So all the aqua becomes grey, and the big wall in front of the gates as you walk in is a big Port Charlotte wall rather than the Bruichladdich Progressive Hebridean Distillers wall. We've got a whole load of imagery and photography and positioning around the distillery, which links to the launch campaign for Port Charlotte, which is, of course, the We Are Islay campaign, and we can talk a bit more about that in a second. But it's really very, very exciting. Normally there's a big truck, if you can picture the truck, where we have the stage and all the bands are on stage, and the backdrop to the truck is a big Aqua Bruichladdich banner. Well, of course, this is going to be Port Charlotte as well. So you'll think for just one day there might actually be a distillery called the Port Charlotte Distillery, and it'll feel like you're there on Sunday coming.
And I guess this is not a prelude to a real Port Charlotte distillery at some point. We keep talking about this, but I got to ask, is there any possibility in the near future that we might see some progress on this?
Well, I think it's a great question, and the question comes up all the time. And in fact, it came up recently. There was a discussion on some local blogs that the Bruichladdich was moving forward and they were going to develop another distillery in Port Charlotte. I think there is a legacy of distilling in Port Charlotte, the village of Port Charlotte, and of course that's what our Port Charlotte brand is named after. You know, it's in homage to the distillery that once stood there, the Loch-in-Dal distillery. Of course, we own that site, and some of the warehouses that are there that date back to probably around 1830, 1835 are still in rude health and have still got lots of our maturing stocks in there. The truth is that we have absolutely no plan to develop a Port Charlotte whiskey distillery in Port Charlotte. It's one of those ones, you know, is it possible? Well, of course it's possible. Is it probable? No, it's probably not probable. So there are no plans for us to do that, Mark.
Anything is possible if you just want to write a big enough check, right?
Yeah, exactly. But we have our hands full at the moment, of course, with all the big projects that we want to do around warehousing. We're still completely committed to ensuring that every single drop of our distillate gets matured on Islay. So, of course, the warehousing program that we've got on at the moment is important, and that's where we are spending our capex investment. And beyond that, we have an ambition for us to create our own maltings at the distillery. Of course, we do Islay Barley versions. 100% of our barley comes from Scotland. We're not ashamed to make a big deal about that. And about a third of our production comes from Islay-grown barley at the moment. And the piece that's missing in our jigsaw would be for us to be able to malt that Islay-grown barley at the distillery itself. So again, we've got plans to introduce a small maltings at the Bruichladdich distillery for us to process our Islay-grown barley. And I think these are the things that are more important to us at the moment, rather than building another distillery. And of course, Bruichladdich as a distillery isn't at full capacity. We're distilling about 1 million litres a year at the moment, and the distillery can do a lot more than that. So, we've no need to build a whole second distillery for making whiskey down the road. It's much more about focusing on the things that we think matter for us to complete the virtuous circle of producing the ultimate reference in terms of Islay single malt Scotch whisky.
Let's talk about the revival of the Port Charlotte range. You changed the packaging, changed the whiskies themselves. Let's go through this, starting with the new Port Charlotte 10-year-old, which replaces the old version that was out several years ago, right?
Yeah, I think the thing that's really interesting for us is, we've always talked about ourselves as being a distillery that has 4 brands, 3 whiskey brands and 1 gin brand. So the botanist sits aside from the whiskey portfolio. But within the whiskey portfolio, we have Bruichladdich, this unpeated Islay single malt. Then we have Port Charlotte, which of course is heavily peated. And then there's Octomore, the super heavily peated one. And the truth is, Port Charlotte has always been in the shadows. We describe it as middle child syndrome. And I think anybody out there that is a middle child will understand exactly what that means. It's in the shadow of Bruichladdich, the namesake, named after the distillery, and then Octomore, this perceived cult product on the other side. And on top of that, we didn't really support Port Charlotte properly because we also gave it the hand-me-down clothes from the big brother. The bottle was the same shape as Bruichladdich. It was the same bottle, slightly different design. The tin was the same. And we never really were able to fully invest in Port Charlotte as a standalone brand. And what we're doing now is taking the chance to really allow Port Charlotte to emerge as a brand in its own right. So we have decided to create some proprietary glass because, of course, the bottle, the famous Oslo bottle that we used for Port Charlotte before, wasn't proprietary. So we've created its own glass. And we also took the chance to revise the packaging that goes with it and take a chance to review the range that goes with it. So your question about the core product in the new range, the Port Charlotte 10-year-old, yes, it does follow on from some previous limited edition releases of Port Charlotte 10-year-old, but this will be the first time that a Port Charlotte 10-year-old is available in a permanent supply. So that's very exciting and that's very interesting. The range is then supported with an Islay Barley version. So we've got a 2011 Islay Barley, and we've also got 2 very exciting cask release limited editions that come out later in the year. One is a Marsala cask, and one is a very famous French wine from the Bordeaux left bank, and it's called MRC01, which is it's named after the Mouton Rothschild casks that it's matured in. So actually a range of 4 products coming out in Port Charlotte, which is another move that helps us support Port Charlotte's emergence as a brand. So it's not just a one-product brand, it's something that's really celebrating the exploration and sort of investigation that we do as a business, looking at barley provenance, looking at cask influence, the influence that has on the spirit, looking at the effects of time and age. So again, bringing everything together in a range that fully describes all the avenues that we explore as whiskey makers. So we're really excited about it. And in fact, the first bottles were produced 2 weeks ago. So I think the bottling line was very busy. Jonathan and the team 2 weeks ago running the first new Port Charlotte bottles down the line and filling them for circulation into the marketplace. So the first two products to be released will be the Port Charlotte 10 and the Port Charlotte Islay Barley.
And you still are committed to doing all the bottling as well on Islay, as well as all the maturation too, right?
Yeah, exactly. This idea that we're Islay-centric in everything that we do, and sometimes it makes life very difficult, but we are completely committed to that. And we often think about if Islay was a French winemaking region, if it was an appellation contrôlée, what would be the rules and what would be what regulations would be in place for us to create something that really merited the badge of Islay. And I think from that point of view, we do take great care to make sure that the conception of the products as well as the distillation happens there. But following on beyond that is so important for us that the maturation happens on Islay 100% of its life and the bottling happens there. And I think that leads into something else as well, which is about yes, we're Islay-centric from a product point of view, but we're also Islay-centric from a community point of view. And we're really keen to not just create jobs on Islay, but to create employment on Islay that gives young people the chance to form a career and not have to move away and establish a career elsewhere. So one of the great success stories recently, in fact, is Chloe Wood of Octomore Farm, and she started in the shop, was an assistant, then worked in our academy team, hosting our academy visitors that were coming over, and is now our brand ambassador for Asia Pacific, based in Singapore, and she's only 23 years old, and I'm sure she won't mind me telling you the story about her, but she's had this great experience working for Bruichladdich because we've created an ecosystem on Islay that is there to serve both the product, the development of the product, but also the community aspect of it as well. So we're really proud of that side of things, and having the bottling facility there as well creates a wonderful buzz of activity on site. When you come to visit Bruichladdich, you come into the courtyard and there's a great hive of people. We'll probably be 100 people by the end of this year working at Bruichladdich. And I think, that keeps us at the forefront of employment. I think that keeps us as the largest independent or the largest private employer on Islay. And that's also one of the reasons that we can put on such a great party for the festival, because with 100 people and 100 people's partners, we can really host a really very good party on Festival Sunday at Bruichladdich. So yeah, it is important. It's very important, Mark. We're committed to Islay. We're committed to the product that we make coming entirely from Islay.
I ask that question because there's been some talk on the island in recent months that perhaps the whiskey industry is sort of overwhelming the infrastructure of the island, and the tourism demand is perhaps actually pricing some Iliocs out of the community. Some ways it's sort of almost become, and I really hate to use this term, but it's become the Disneyland for whiskey in a lot of ways. What's being done on the island to try to, at least from the industry side, to try to minimize that impact a little bit? Because by this time, 2 years from now, you're going to be up to 11 distilleries now.
Yeah, it's a really good question, Mark. And I think the Disneyfication of a whiskey region is something that you need to be really conscious of from a community point of view. I think there is a risk that, we are entrepreneurs and we're all for entrepreneurialism, but there is a risk that Islay gets leveraged for the badge of Islay, and it becomes, we often say Islay's a provenance, it's not a flavour profile. And I think for Islay itself, it needs to be careful that there aren't a whole load of startup businesses coming in that are just leveraging the badge of Islay without investing in the infrastructure to really support that business and to support the community. So coming back again to the point of our business, which is a complete commitment to Islay, whether that be an investment in the Pathways project between Bruichladdich and Port Charlotte, whether that be bursaries for the local high school, whether that be creating employment for young people coming in to work in the bottling hall or to work in the warehouse. We do believe in a complete commitment to the place, and I think that we are aware that there is a kind of upswell of emotion attached to the number of distilleries that are supposedly being opened or invested in on Islay. So this is new startup distilleries. And I think as an employer on Islay, we do have an obligation to work with the local authority. We do have an obligation to work with the ferry providers, with the roads department. We do have an obligation to work with the housing authorities to make sure that things are being pushed in the right direction to support the overall infrastructure of the island, and it doesn't just get ransacked because of its pedigree and because of its badge. So there are a number of groups and bodies coming together at the moment, and of course Bruichladdich is involved in all of these, where there are big discussions happening about the future investment levels that need to go into Islay to allow it to sustain the tourism that's happening and the level of investment that's coming from entrepreneurs and startups. So yeah, it's a really interesting time. In the past, Islay would have had 15,000, 16,000 people living there, and just now it's probably somewhere between 3,000 and 3,500. So it's far below the historical numbers of people living on Islay, but of course that was a long time ago, and they weren't using cars and trucks and ferries in the same way. So yes, you're right. There is a lot of heat in the press about it at the moment. Whether or not tourism is pricing locals out of the market or not, I don't think that's just an Islay problem. I think you find that across the world. There are places where holidaymakers buy up housing stock. So I think, again, from a housing point of view, we are already talking internally about how we can look in the future to support employees in the business get onto the property ladder, and we see this again as a complete commitment to the island and the community aspect of it, rather than just leveraging the badge of Islay.
Do you think it ever might get back to the point where the distilleries actually wind up providing housing for their employees the way they did many, many years ago? Now it's just the managers.
It's not a crazy thought, Mark, and it's certainly, that specific topic is something that we've talked about internally very recently. The potential need to do that, or the possibility of wanting to do that in the future. So we haven't made any firm plan, we haven't made any firm commitment to it, but I think the fact that that topic is even on the agenda for us as a business, I think is a really interesting point.
Let's move away from that now, because that's the stuff that is creating controversy. But I want to find out how things are working within the Remy Cointreau portfolio now, because this is the first time in many years that Bruichladdich actually had partners around the world, with Westland in Seattle, Domaine des Hautes-Glaces in France. How are you guys working things with the other distilleries? I know Matt Hoffman has been over from Westland to visit you guys at least once or twice, and I would assume the guys from France have come up. But how is this sort of network within the Remy family working?
It's brilliant. For the first time ever, we are part of a little internal whiskey community, a whiskey portfolio. And in fact, we were all out in Seattle last week, which was great. When I say all of us, not all 100 of us, but a group of us were out in Seattle last week with the Westland team. Unfortunately, Fred couldn't join us from Domaine des Hautes-Glaces, but we were talking about this collective of whiskey distilleries that now sit in a portfolio under Simon's control as part of the Remy Cointreau brands portfolio. And we had some fabulous discussions about the things that make us similar and the things that make us different. There are huge synergies between us, but there are also very clear individual personalities of each of the distilleries themselves. So I think it serves as an exciting opportunity for the group to leverage a whiskey portfolio that is completely different to any of the big competitors out there in terms of their whiskey portfolios. We've got high provenance, high concept, founder-led, entrepreneurial. Some of them are organic, some of them are not. Focus on creating whiskies that upend the single malt whiskey category as it currently stands, and cause consumers to stop, or clients to stop and think about the brands that they're drinking at the moment and this alternative choice that can emerge. So it really is a very exciting time. We're like-minded as distilleries, but we're all individual. You know, if you look at the way Westland produce their whiskies and the fact that they take, you know, we talk about terroir in terms of where the barley's grown and how it's grown and where the stocks are matured and the terroir of Islay or terroir of Scotland. But Westland talk about cultural terroir. They talk about the influences in the Pacific Northwest of brewing and how roasted barley in a 5 malt recipe is really interested for them, and why brewer's yeast is interesting for them to use because of its cultural relevance as opposed to distiller's yeast being used from a Bruichladdich point of view. So it's a really exciting time, and that's us now got an international high provenance single malt portfolio under the Remy Cointreau umbrella. And I think the future is really bright for brands like us and distillery businesses like us to really shout and really try and get attention for what we do and why we do it and why it's interesting and why the sort of smoke and mirrors and marketing machine of the big brands isn't the only way.
And thanks to Bruichladdich Douglas Taylor for spending some time with us on WhiskyCast In-Depth. It's brought to you by Lagavulin, Islay's legendary single malt. Look for the classic 16-year-old, the Distiller's Edition, and the new 8-year-old Lagavulin at a whiskey shop near you. Find out more at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. I haven't been able to get any of that new Port Charlotte 10-year-old yet, but Bruichladdich recently released some older single cask bottlings from the mid-'80s. Let's start off with the Bruichladdich 1984 32-year-old Bourbon Cask Edition. It's bottled at 43.7% ABV. The nose is nice and oaky with sweeter notes of caramel, vanilla, honey, and butterscotch. The taste is sweet and fudgy with touches of spices, dark chocolate, and honey. The spices linger aromatically in the back of your throat with just a hint of oakiness. The finish is a bit short on the palate, but those aromatic notes last and last on the throat. I'm scoring the Bruichladdich 1984 32-year-old Bourbon Cask Edition a 91. Next up, the 1986 30-year-old Sherry Cask Edition. This one is bottled at 44.6% ABV, and the nose has notes of red grapes, black cherries, plums, soft spices, and hints of toffee and figs. The taste is thick, fruity, and nectar-like with peaches, red grapes, black cherries, and slowly building spices with a strong sherry influence. The finish is long, gentle, and delicate, with a slightly astringent touch and subtle spices. I'm scoring the Bruichladdich 1986 30-year-old Sherry Cask Edition a 92. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, our tasting notes are brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery, where they're making room in the trophy case after the recent San Francisco World Spirits Competition. Best bourbon, Henry McKenna Single Barrel. The best small batch bourbon, Elijah Craig Small Batch. Just more proof of Heaven Hill's pedigree for making whiskeys with award-winning flavor. Meet the family at heavenhilldistillery.com. Think wisely, drink wisely. There's been a lot of talk in the last few weeks about George Dickel's new Tabasco Barrel Finish whiskey that Diageo produced in cooperation with Louisiana's McElhenney family, which owns the Tabasco sauce brand and uses whiskey barrels in the production of its sauce. This one falls into that category of flavored whiskeys where the ABV can legally be below 40%. In this case, it's 35% ABV. And what has not really been mentioned a lot is that it's made up of a blend of George Dickel's regular whiskey with some that's been finished in the Tabasco sauce barrels. Let's keep that in mind for a couple of minutes. The nose has a soft pepperiness with honey, vanilla, and a hint of oak. So far, so good. The taste starts off with a note of flat caramel cola, then the Tabasco sauce spices kick in and overwhelm everything else. The finish? Long and spicy. No kidding. I had a hard time finding the whiskey in this one once the spices kicked in, and that's my key for deciding whether a flavored whiskey is any good. But I'll admit that it was not as intense and not as bad as I'd expected. Still, this stuff was made for doing shots and cocktails, not sipping. And I'm scoring the George Dickel Tabasco Barrel Finish a 75. Now, while other whiskey writers have been talking about the Dickel-Tabasco partnership, this may be the only place that can put it into its proper context. You see, Dickel's Tabasco Barrel Finish is not the only one of its kind, and I just happen to have a sample to compare it to. Back in the spring of 2016, Seattle's Westland Distillery released Inferno as its annual April Fool's Day whiskey. It was a 4-year-old single malt that spent that entire time in what the distillery euphemistically referred to as, quote, a cask that once held chili pepper sauce. That kept the trademark lawyers happy. And remember when I mentioned that the Dickel Tabasco Barrel Finish was a blend of regular George Dickel whiskey and the stuff that had been finished in those Tabasco sauce barrels? I only wish that had been the case here. On top of that, Matt Hoffman and his team decided to bottle Inferno at cask strength, 58.4% ABV. Here we go, kids. The nose starts off malty and subtle, but with a clear spiciness of that so-called chili pepper sauce that builds up the longer it sits in the glass, along with a touch of honey. Now, let me quote directly from my tasting journal. Oh dear God. Intense spices, butyric and nasty, like slamming a shot of straight Tabasco sauce. The finish? Way too fucking long. Arg! Make it stop. Please, make it stop. Let me quote now from the original 2016 Westland news release, in which Matt Hoffman said, quote, we have succumbed to a vile revenge, and now impose it upon all of you. Forgive us. Matt, no fucking way. Inferno is literally one of the 2 worst whiskeys I have ever tasted, on a par with the equally god-awful Fishkey. And for only the second time, I'm handing out the lowest score I have ever given. Westland Inferno gets a 40. Even if it was an April Fool's joke, this one was a sick, twisted joke. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. And yes, while it would be tempting to skip that last one, I will be adding all of these tasting notes to our searchable list of nearly 2,200 whiskeys at whiskycast.com.
Redbreast fans have always cherished our whiskey's sherry notes, so we set out to embellish that character. Introducing the Redbreast Listowel edition, a quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey finished in first fill Oloroso sherry casks from Spain's prestigious Bodegas Listowel. Carrying Redbreast's trademark pot still spices and dark dried fruit notes, the Listowel edition is graced with an enduring sherry finish that would be better described as a final act. Discover the newest branch on the Redbreast family tree.
Let's open up the inbox now for your voice, presented by Lot 40. Had this comment on the last episode and our interview with the Macallan's Ken Greer about the new Macallan Distillery and Visitors Center in Speyside. At Whiskey Girl 6 posted this on Twitter. Don't know what to make of this new distillery and visitors center. Looks odd. Guess I'll have to go and see it. Have my doubts. Well, let's give them credit for doing something outside of the box. It would have been easy to build something traditional looking with pagodas that don't have a purpose and all sorts of stuff like that. Thanks to everyone who sent along congratulations on our 700th episode of WhiskyCast the other night. At Mikey Joe Drum on Twitter asked, 70-year-old dram to celebrate? Great idea. Don't have one quite that old anymore, though, after I tasted my tiny wee sample of Gordon and MacPhail's 75-year-old Mortlock a while back. Rhonda Moore tweeted this from Ottawa, Ontario. I bet you could crowdsource a 70-year-old sample if you promised a feature to go along with it. Doubtful we could still consider it whiskey at that point, though. Maybe the ghost of a whiskey past. Thanks, Rhonda, but just a reminder, we never promise editorial coverage for anything, including whiskey samples. And finally, on the news that Lagavulin manager Georgie Crawford is stepping down at the distillery so that she can lead the project to revive Diageo's Port Ellen distillery just down the road, Klaus Dobelmann tweeted this note from Austria. Go Georgie! We'll second that, Klaus. And if you have something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always post it on the Your Voice page at whiskycast.com. Or track us down on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or Tumblr at WhiskyCast. Your Voice is presented by Lot 40, Canada's award-winning 100% pot still rye whiskey. Lot 40, unapologetically Canadian. Please drink responsibly. Let's wrap things up now with Behind the Label, our inside look at some of the science, history, and other things that make whiskey unique. The last weekend of May usually marks the start of the summer vacation season for whiskey lovers in the Northern Hemisphere, and no doubt there will be a lot of vacationers trying to get their festival bottles off of Islay over the next few days. I'm often asked about the safest way to make sure your souvenir bottles from a whiskey trip get home safely. One of my usual tips is that if you have a whiskey that came in a canister or a box, take it out and then put the bottle inside a sock, then try to put it back inside the container if it fits. You see, it's not the impacts from outside your suitcase that you really need to worry about. It's bottles banging into hard objects inside your bags that usually cause the problem. Of course, whiskey brand ambassadors have become experts at solving this problem. I asked Diageo's Ewan Gunn how he does it.
Carefully, I think, would be the answer. I'm in the fortunate position that a lot of the brands that I work on are already, present in market and, widely available. So very often I try to avoid traveling with whiskey if at all possible, and have the market team have it ready for me on arrival. When I do have to travel with it, though, I tend to wrap as much of my clothing around it as possible in rolls, and then put it in the middle of my case.
When you find bottles on the road to bring home, too, right?
Yeah, same thing. Wrap them up, roll them in layer upon layer of clothing, and then right in the middle of the case, surrounded by as much as you can. But to be honest, I try to avoid checking your case whenever possible, so I rarely actually travel with Scotch.
You ever had a bottle break?
Touch wood, no, I actually have not. But which now makes me very worried that's going to happen in my near future. But no, I never have. I've always been very, very, very careful to just wrap anything I'm traveling with really, really well.
And touch wood, too. I've never had a whiskey bottle break in my suitcase. I have had it happen with beer bottles, though, since the pressure changes during a flight can cause a bottle cap to pop. But corks and capsules are usually just porous enough to allow for slight air pressure changes in flight. Here's one other tip for you. Check the bottling strength on your whiskeys before you pack your suitcase. Depending on where you're flying out of, the limits can vary. Most airlines won't let anything stronger than 70% ABV in checked baggage, but Islay's Gleneagledale Airport is known for being even stricter. It won't let you fly with anything stronger than 60% ABV. I have never been able to find out just how many cask-strength bottles get left behind at the Islay Airport, or what happens to them. If you have something you'd like us to dig into on Behind the Label, just get in touch with us by using the contact form at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find links for our WhiskyCast Tasting Panel podcast, brought to you by the Whiskey Exchange. along with our WhiskyCast HD videos, the latest whiskey news, events, my tasting notes, photos, and a whole lot more, along with a complete archive of our past episodes. We'd love to get your opinion on the changes we've made to WhiskyCast over the last few weeks. Please let us know what you think on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or Tumblr at WhiskyCast, or you can email us. The address is comments@whiskycast.com.
This is Whiskey, Johnny Walker's Scotch Whisky, from this place and these people, aye, Scotch makers, creating the bold and complex flavour of Johnny Walker Black Label. Step right up.
WhiskyCast. Brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2018, and comes to you twice each week from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.